Hi class, welcome back. It's Dr. Lindner. In this next section, we're going to be looking at the neuron, but we're going to be talking about the structural and functional classification of neurons. And if you think of one of my previous videos, when if we looked at the brain and then we looked at the spinal cord, right? We said that messages can kind of come in and go up, or messages can start in the brain, go down and out. The ascending ones that go up and in, those are called sensory or afferent. And the ones that start in the brain and kind of come down and out, those are called motor or efferent messages. Well, that's in the large scheme of things, right? That's in the brain and the spinal cord in the neural system. But neurons themselves are classified as sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. An interneuron is just as it sounds. It's saying, what do we have that can connect? What do we have that can connect the sensory to the motor? Where's the bridge between these two? Because the sensory information came in and then motor information came out, the sensory had to relay that information to the motor side. So that relay, the relay man, is known as an interneuron or an association neuron. Okay, so when we look at the spinal cord, and what we're looking at off to the right is a picture of the spinal cord. And if I were to draw a dotted line through the center, everything from this dotted line backwards is dorsal or posterior, and everything from this dotted line forward, that's ventral or anterior. Okay, this is dorsal or posterior. Now, when we look at, this is again the cross section of the spinal cord off to the right. Okay, we're looking at a spinal cord. Now, when we look at the center, when you look at the center of that spinal cord, you see something that looks like a butterfly. Now, the butterfly is gray matter. This is gray matter, and everything around it is white matter. Meaning everything white is myelinated. Everything gray is unmyelinated. So gray matter is unmyelinated. White matter is myelinated. Right? That's an important concept. The gray matter back here that looks like the letter H or the butterfly has horns. These horns in the back, these are called dorsal horns. So I'm just going to put DH for dorsal horns. Now, if there's a dorsal horn, the horns in the front, these are going to be called ventral horns. So you got dorsal horns. This is a dorsal horn, and this is a dorsal horn, and ventral horn, and ventral horn. Okay? All right, so we understand that so far. In the white matter, we have columns. We have columns. Columns. So back here, everything that we see back here, and everything we see back here, these are called dorsal columns. These in the front, these are called ventral columns. And off to the side, these are called lateral columns. So you have dorsal columns, ventral columns, and lateral columns. Columns are all in the white matter. Wherever we have this white matter, this is where we're going to have the up elevators and down elevators, meaning the ascending tracks and descending tracks all exist in the white matter. The up elevators are sensory tracks. The down elevators are motor tracks. Okay, the next thing that I want you to understand is that information that comes in the back, information that comes in through the dorsal, everything in here that's moving in this direction, this is all sensory information that's moving in this direction. From the anterior horns coming out in this direction, this is all motor information. So we have, it looks like a nail or a pin hitting your skin. And there's a pain receptor on the finger of your hand. And that receptor picks up this input, the stimuli, and it's going to send that sensory information through this sensory neuron, right into the spinal cord. And there is a synapse. There is a connection in the dorsal horn. It's going to relay that information to the motor neuron. What is this relay man? What is this relay man in the center, right here? So this relay, that's your interneuron. So your sensory neuron sends the information in to the dorsal horn. It synapses, it's going to relay that information into the interneuron. Remember, there's sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons, aka association neurons. So this is an association or an interneuron that's going to relay that input to the ventral horn, and then the motor neuron sends the information out to the muscle that's going to make it contract to withdraw from that painful stimulus, because remember, your finger got pricked by that nail. So again, painful input going into the finger, and you think your finger hurts, but the finger doesn't feel anything. The finger doesn't feel anything. All that information is perceived by the brain. Okay? You have some information that's going up to the brain, while this information goes to the biceps, and as quickly as it's felt, boom, you withdraw. So sensory information in, motor information out. And the other thing I want you to know is that this sensory neuron is going to synapse on the dorsal horn, whereas motor information or efferent information comes out through the ventral horn, and this is a motor neuron right to the muscle. Now, right here, I want you to pay attention to this. Notice that this dorsal root, this dorsal neuron is also called a dorsal root, and this motor neuron is called a ventral root. Notice that this dorsal root has this little lollipop stick right here. This one doesn't, and the ventral root doesn't. Only the dorsal root does. Now, this is called a ganglia. This is called a ganglia. And what a ganglia is, ganglia or ganglion, whichever, they're both synonymous. A ganglion, I'm going to abbreviate this, and you can rewrite it on the playback if you want to. A ganglion is a group of nerve cell bodies, outside the CNS. So a group or a cluster of nerve cell bodies outside the CNS means it's in the PNS, right? The peripheral neural system. So this is a cluster of nerve cell bodies. That's what this is. When you have a cluster or a group of nerve cell bodies in the CNS, if it's in the CNS, then we call it a nucleus. So a group of nerve cell bodies outside the CNS, that's a ganglion. If it's inside, the CNS, then that's a nucleus. All right. So just want you to pay attention to this ganglion. So the name of this ganglion, because it's in the dorsal root, they abbreviate it as dorsal root ganglion, the DRG. And the dorsal root is always much wider. It's much more dilated and wider than the ventral root for that reason that's where the dorsal root ganglia exists. It's a cluster or a group of nerve cell bodies. So because you have this clustering of nerve cell bodies, this is always going to be much more dilated. And this is an important anatomical feature so that when you're looking at a cross section of the spinal cord, if no one is there to tell you what's anterior and what's posterior, look for that reference point. Look for the nerves, look for the nerve roots, and go, do I see a ganglia? If I see the ganglia, then that's on the dorsal side. So this is the dorsal root. That's the dorsal root ganglia. That's the dorsal horn. That means that's ventral horn and ventral root. Okay? Now, in terms of structural classification, this was function. When we look at structure, it can be either a multipolar, bipolar, or unipolar neuron. Now, the one that's the most common type and the one that we've been focusing on is the multipolar, and that's the classical one where you've got your dendrites, your cell body, right? You got the nissl bodies, you got the axon hillock, the axon, right? This is the one that we typically talk about when we talk about the neuron to learn all of its components. That's the most common type. You got several dendrites with one axon, okay? Bipolar is where you have one main dendrite coming off the cell body and one main axon coming off the cell body. These are found in the eye, the ear, the nose, kind of like your special senses, right? Smell, hearing, and sight. Those are bipolar. Now, unipolar, if we look at this one, it's very interesting. It only has one process, right? Here's the cell body, and there's one process. Now, if we look at this structure and we turn it sideways, we kind of have this structure, the lollipop stick. Doesn't that look like that? Sure does. So a unipolar neuron is always found in the sensory neuron where we have a dorsal root ganglia. That's always unipolar. And unipolar develops from bipolar. So it starts as a bipolar, and then what ends up happening, if you can visualize this, is that this structure here pinches off. It moves in this direction. So when this moves away and pinches off, you end up with one process. Okay? Okay, so when we look at this, you've got dendrites, 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 dendrites. You got your cell body, you got your one axon. That's your multipolar neuron. And sometimes the interneurons are named association or interneuron, but these association or interneurons can be named after the histologists that first discovered and described them, and sometimes by their shape or by their appearance. So when we look at the pyramidal cell, it's because the cell body is more pyramid shaped. And Purkinje fibers, which are pretty common within the cerebellum and in the brain, these Purkinje cells are named after the histologist. Okay. All right, great. When we come back, we'll get into the neuroglial cells.